Dennis Edwards was one of the best uh, singers in the history of R&B soul music, and one of the best of the Temptations. He was the one that could jump up, sing, dance at any given moment, always full of energy and always kept a smile on his face. It was his voice that carried the Temptations through the most memorable time, and it was his voice that came to define the Temptations vocally throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s. And now Dennis Edwards was born February 3rd, 1943, in Fairfield, Alabama, about 8 miles from Birmingham. His father, who was a reverend, moved the family to Detroit, Michigan, when Dennis was around 10 years old, and he was singing his father's church. Eventually, he took over his choir, and that was after joining the gospel act, the Mighty Clouds of Joy, by the time he was a teenager. Even though Dennis knew he could sing, he really wanted to be a factory worker. Like everybody else that lived in Detroit at that time, but once he graduated high school, he ended up joining the Army for Lord Short when he returned from the military. He went back home very Gordy. And his Motown record label was the hottest thing in the world at the time, even though it was forbidden for him to sing secular music because he was raised in the church. But now all of his friends were singing that type of music, trying to break into the industry. And plus, he was inspired by his idol, Sam Cooke, who did the same thing in 1961. He put together his own band called Dennis. My dad's in the Fireballs, hoping to or deal with Motown one day. While performing at a small club, one of very Gordy's producers from the Funk Brothers, like Dennis' voice, and Guy had my audition for Motown Records, now Barry. Wardy loved in his voice too, but he didn't have the time to work on music with him because he had a lot of other artists on his label at the time. So retainers signing him to a work for hire contract, filling in for acts when needed. You know, the first 2 years with Motown, Dennis was getting like $250 to $300 a week just for being on a roster, because Berry Gordy, he had no work for him at the time. But until one day he got that call. uh, um, that one of the Contours lead singers got really sick while they were on tour, as in opening act for the Temptations. He was needed to fill in. Now, Dennis ended up becoming the lead singer for the Contours, recording the 1967 R&B Top 30. Oh, it's so hard being a loser, and your love grows more precious every day. But while touring with the Temptations, Dennis became good friends. We're all members, especially David Ruffin. I think during that time, the Temptations was tired of David Ruffin and was having problems with him his lifestyle and the way he lived during that time. David, um, I Ruffin told Dennis Edwards that the Temptations were gonna kick him out of the group and asks him to take his place. Sure enough, the next day, Dennis got that. All he couldn't refuse the offer leave. Um, his group, the Contours Now, with the Temptations while performing Upset David. Ruffin will crash the stage while Dennis Edwards was sing lead vocals on a Too Proud to Beg everywhere they went, or months. So the group decided to hold up on Dennis with the promise of a solo. Um, okay, deal from Motown, and they brought David Ruffin back into the group. But once the David Ruffin continued with his behavior and not show up for the shows, they put Dennis Edwards back in the group permanently this time. Now, Dennis vocals will give the Temptations a string of hits such as Cloud 9, She Next to You, Ball of Confusion. That's what the world is today. Papa is a Rolling Stone in Shaky Ground. The singles Cloud 9. And Papa was a Rolling Stone won Grammy Awards. It was Amy were the very first Grammy Awards for the Motown label. Also during that time, he started dating Aretha Franklin. Her 1972. Well, classic song Daydreaming was about Denis as the two fell in love and were close to marriage until Denis was caught cheating with Ruth Pointer of the Pointer Sisters in 1977 to 1980, began to bomb his with members Melvin Franklin and Otis Williams, angry that Motown were focusing too much on Dennis as a lead vocalist. Plus, they didn't like Denis' cocaine drug habit. So he ended up leaving the group in 1977. But in 1980, he rejoined the Temptations, performing with ex-members David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks for the reunion album and the tour. The reunion and the tour fell apart due to David Ruffin's drug habit and Dennis Edwards missing shows and rehearsals once again of solo artists, and back with Motown Records. Dennis released his 1984 hit Don't Look Any Further, which peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Black Singles charts and number 72 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the UK, that song peaked at number 45, pushing his album to number 2 on the R&B charts. The song Don't Look Any Further is also sampled by Biggie Smalls in the Junior Mafia for their hit Get Money As. A remix in 1987, the Temptations got back together again. But Dennis Edwards was fired from the group for the final time in late 1988. Over the years, most of the Temptation members passed on. David Ruffin would die from a cocaine overdose in 1991. And Eddie Kendricks died from lung cancer in 1993. Melvin Franklin fell into a diabetic coma and died. On In Life, Dennis Edwards were taught and continued to make music throughout his career, but in 2017, Dennis Edwards fell ill, reportedly, from meningitis, which made him a quadriplegic, leaving him bedbound and immobile, even though he was on a lot of medications and was reportedly depressed and paranoid now. Dennis Edwards' daughter, who was the point of his power of attorney, says she never heard his doctors say he had meningitis, but see, Dennis Edwards now. Wife Brenda Edwards decided to move him from his St. Louis home to a luxury high-rise apartment building in Chicago. While in Chicago, Dennis took a nasty fall and was taken to the hospital. An anonymous tipster called a state hotline and said Brenda Edwards had abused Dennis when a caseworker had visited him in his apartment. Dennis told them that his wife is trying by suffocating him, holding it as face down in the pillow, and she took his hearing aids away from him. The caseworker called the police and had Dennis Edwards removed from the house. Oh, the caseworker even filed an emergency order of protection claiming Brenda was a threat to Dennis. Brenda Edwards hired her own lawyer to challenge the order of protection, but Dennis died a day before she was supposed to appear in court. So the emergency protective order that she had against her was clear, but the final autopsy report on Dennis Edwards' death by the Cook County medical examiners found no signs of abuse, ruling he died due to the complications of meningitis. And an interview on CBS, Brenda Airways says she loved Dennis, and so they were married for 18 years. She would have never done anything to harm him, and the allegations are false, but Dennis Edwards' daughters think differently. He was 74 years old. Dennis Edwards